Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Chee-Tash. My name is Chris, and we are back with the bell curve today, going over Chapter 11, all about crime and how IQ potentially has a correlation with crime. If you guys remember last time, going over Chapter 10, we talked about parenting and how the maternal IQ has a potential effect on various aspects of a child growing up and a child being all the way from like being a toddler, young adult, etc. Talked about things such as birth weight, growing up in a home environment. What else did we talk about from that chapter? Infant mortality, poverty, etc. All these different factors. Today, it's all about crime. And do lower IQ people commit more crime? It's an interesting chapter. And let's just kick things right off. The authors start off with this graph right here, taking a look at a history of this boom in violent crime after the 1950s. So if you take a look at this graph here, the proportional change in number of violent crimes reported to the police. And in 1950, it equaled 1. So what this is saying, the proportional change, so it's kind of like the percentage change. Like how much higher is it being reported compared to 1950, which is like, that's like the threshold, which is 1. That's like that, and you can look at that line that goes all the way horizontally at the bottom there. That's the trend line for 1950 to 1963, and then something happened in 1963 where it just started to boom, started to balloon, and then there's even a steeper trend line for 1985 to 1992, right about the time when this book is to come out. So really interesting. The authors do kind of talk about this. The rate from 1950 to 1963 was almost flat. We see that from the graph. And then what followed, an extreme rapid rise from 64 to 71, continued increases until the 80s. And then 1985 to 1992 is even steeper than the one for 63 to 80. They took this graph, they created this graph from statistics in the FBI's Uniform Crime Reports. So I'm sure there'll be some skeptics out there, people who are critical of this graph. What does it really mean? What does violent crimes mean? Where are they getting this data from? Can it be trusted? All very, very valid points. Actually, oh, look at that. The source is right down there. The Uniform Crime Reports from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. All very, very interesting points. Does this say anything about IQ? Does IQ have anything to do with the trend lines that were established looking at this graph? I don't know. Let's find out. Let's take a look. Let's go to the next slide here. So the authors make an argument against IQ. So the two arguments against criminals being psychologically distinctive, what they are saying here is the two arguments that people usually argue against IQ being anywhere remotely involved in the chances of you being involved in crime. And that's kind of a very general term, like crime. Like crime could be like shoplifting, all the way to a very violent offense like second-degree murder, things like that. And they're kind of lumping it all in together. That is kind of interesting, and I wonder if that can be parsed out between, does IQ have an effect on crime as a whole or just like an effect on violent crime? Let's get into these two arguments, though. So the first argument here, and I'll read it straight from the book on page 238, and I kind of sum it up there in the first bullet point. Crime rates have changed in recent times more than people's cognitive ability or personalities could have. We must therefore find the reason for the rising crime rates in people's changing circumstances. Okay, so they're saying that the changes, people's cognitive abilities, they don't rise or fall that fast as compared to the rise in crime. Explain that. Okay, so that is an interesting argument. And the authors kind of talk about how, this really huge boom in the crime rate, as seen from the graph on the previous slide, could be just changing generational dynamics. So you have the baby boomers who were young kids, World War II, post World War II. Now, 1950 to 1963, they're starting to get a little older, right? They're starting to get a little older. It's a huge generation. All of a sudden, you have a lot of young men. I mean, women also commit crime too, but I think in this book, they're mainly talking about, they're going to explain it too. They're mainly looking at white men commit way more of the crimes than like young white women. And just that change in dynamic, more of a youthful generation coming of age, just more crime is going to happen. So there is something to be said about that. The next point here, the next argument, behavior is criminal only because society says so. There cannot be psychological tendencies to engage in behavior defined so arbitrarily. Okay, so they go on to explain this argument made frequently during the 1960s and 70s, always more popular among intellectuals than with the general public, is heard most often, opposing any suggestion that criminal behavior has biological roots. So it's only a crime, or the behavior is criminal only because society says so. Okay, well, I don't know if I really agree with that, because there's certain things I think we should all agree on that are typically bad behaviors. I don't know how I feel about that second argument there that they talk about. But they go on to say that the link in this next section, the link between cognitive ability and criminal behavior, they kind of take a little bit of an overview of this, starting from some gentleman in the earlier 20th century, early 1900s, Charles Goring, who's a British physician, had mentioned a lack of intelligence as one of the distinguishing traits of the prison population. I guess he was a big contributor to modern criminology. And then in 1914, we had this gentleman, H.H. Goddard, who had said he had used intelligence tests and concluded that a large fraction of convicts were intellectually abnormal. Continue on, you have the work in the 1920s by a psychologist, Carl Murchison, who produced data showing that the prisoners of Leavenworth, I don't know what Leavenworth is. Sounds like a American prison is kind of what it sounds like. But the prisoners of Leavenworth had a higher mean IQ than that of enlisted men in World War I. Okay, 1931, then you had Edwin Sutherland, America's most prominent criminologist, wrote Mental Deficiency at Crime, which was an article. And he observed accurately that the ostensible IQ differences between criminals and the general population were diminishing as testing procedures improved. Interesting. So now the narrative is starting to change. And then they even go on to explain in the 60s and 70s, criminology books were starting to downplay the role of IQ in crime. And I think we got to distinguish something here. High IQ and low IQ in how it relates to crime. But there are definitely criminals who you would say are smart, right? There are criminals who get away with crimes, and like we kind of think about them as smart. I think the authors have talked about this before. I think we've talked about this earlier in these chapters, about what it means to have a high IQ and what it means to like just talk really well and present yourself really well. Because you could fake being smart. Right, you could come across as very smart and speak very eloquently and be very persuasive. But does that mean you have a high IQ? I don't know. And like we've said, there's very successful people who that's their skill set. they might not have a high IQ, but they're very successful. They have a skill set and they're able to sell it, right? But does that mean their IQ is high? And does it really even matter? Then we're going all back to that point. So I don't know. It's an interesting point to talk about. Let's continue on though, because this is where we come across some first statistics here. On page 242, the size of the IQ gap. So they had data here talking about literature as a whole. Incarcerated offenders had an average IQ of about 92, 8 points below the mean. Population of non-offenders averaged about more than 100 points. As informed guess puts the gap between offenders and non-offenders at about 10 points. So I don't know where they got this data from. It might have been from the NLSY. Might have been, but these are like our first steps into the foray of, hey, does lower IQ increase your chances of violent crime, of being a criminal? And so far from surveys, although they don't mention where this was from, it seems like there is a slight difference here. Then they go on to mention this Swedish community study of about 500 boys in an unidentified Swedish community. 30% of all arrests of the men by age 30 were of the 6% with IQs below 77 at the age of 10. So a good chunk of the 30% of all of these arrests were by these kids who had IQs below 77, right? And then they go on to mention that 80% were of those with IQs below 100. Interesting. Those don't add up to 100%, so I kind of question, unless I'm interpreting this wrong. But yeah, 80% and then 30%, that doesn't add up to 100%. That's more. So I don't know. That was kind of a funny, I don't know if they just worded it incorrectly or I'm just looking at it in the wrong way. Then there was this Danish study. Sons whose fathers had a criminal record were 6 times as likely to have a record themselves. But those who did not have a police record had an IQ of 1 standard deviation above the ones who did have a record. Okay, very interesting. More data on this. I definitely think that first bullet point, though, of the Denmark study, that has a lot to say about it and how your family situation, we're going to talk about being from a broken home, how much that affects your chances of going into crime. Next, we have this New Zealand study, high-risk and low-risk groups for delinquency. Higher IQs did not become delinquent. What page was this on? This was on page 244. Interesting. So the higher the IQ, the more probability that you were going to be just normal. You weren't going to become delinquent, which I believe just means like going into crime or like having bad behavior, etc. Then we come to this side, IQ and types of criminal involvement. We have, let's take first a look at the table on the left, criminality and IQ among white males. So, deepest level of contact with the criminal justice system. This goes from starting at the top, none, going to the bottom, which is sentenced to a correctional facility. So it gets progressively worse as you go down the table, and the mean IQ of those people in that core cohorts. And this, they did take a look at studies from the NLSY for white males in the 1980 interview cohort. And as you can see, the mean IQ of people who were sentenced to a correctional facility, 93, compared to those who had no level of contact with the criminal justice system. Look, that's like a 13-point difference, so fairly significant. And then you have the table on the right, the odds of getting involved with the police and courts for young white males. So this typical bell curve table, you have the different cognitive classes. We've seen this before, folks. And take a look at the very right. Again, you have the most severe at the very right. Sentenced to incarceration, 0 for the very bright. So like nobody, or like very like low. And then you had for the very dull, 7% sentenced to incarceration. It becomes a little less kind of clear. I mean, look at convicted of an offense. 3% for the very bright, 21% for the dull, but then 14% for the very dull. So it's almost like to be a criminal, you have to be somewhat competent, but you can't. It comes to a point where there's like a law of diminishing returns. You can't be so dull that you don't know exactly what you're doing, but it's more like you have to be able to carry out the plan, but not have like foresight or knowledge to realize that, hey, this is a bad idea. So take a look. I mean, booked for an offense, dull versus very dull, 27% to 17%. I mean, look at that. Stop by the police, dull, 46%, very dull, 33%, very bright, 18%, right? Everybody gets stopped by the cops, right? So, yeah, it is interesting. I don't know from this if it's quite as clear. I mean, you could easily combine the dull and very dull into like that. They kind of go together, so to speak, although there's probably a huge difference between very dull and dull. I think that is a standard deviation difference, I believe. Yeah, you know what? I think it is. I think very dull is 2 standard deviations below the mean, and dull is 1 standard deviation below the mean. So both kind of not great being below the mean, but obviously very dull is 1 standard deviation more below the mean. So these are interesting stats here from the NLSY. Let's continue on. The odds of doing time for young white males as represented by the percentage ever interviewed in a correctional facility. Okay, wow. Now we have, look at that for the very dull, 12%, which is almost just as much as the top 4 cognitive classes combined. Very interesting there. Very interesting. Next, we're going to have the line graphs. And we have 2 sets of these lines, 2 sets of black and gray line pairs. One looking at the importance. Okay, the top one is looking at in the top decile for self-reported crime. The bottom one is ever interviewed in a correctional facility. The black lines, again, represent IQ. Gray lines, parental socioeconomic status. And you can see from these graphs, these lines, the authors are purporting here that IQ, again, kind of a protective factor in your chances of reporting, self-reporting crime history, or being interviewed in a correctional facility. I mean, take a look if for interviewed in a correctional facility, it goes from a 14% close to like almost 0, and then for top decile of self-reported crime, you're going from like 16 to 7%. So, you know, there is a difference. There is a difference, but is it as high? I don't know. Like, and the author's going to say here, you know, that IQ has more of an effect than socioeconomic status, or from, let's go to the next slide, being from a broken home, right? But are there other things that the authors didn't take a look at here that can contribute to your chances of being interviewed in a correctional facility or self-reporting some crime? Also, self-reporting, I mean, how can we really trust that people are willing to self-report? They did bring this up in the book, and how trustworthy this data is versus, you know, FBI crime statistics, let's say, right? Because you would think most people, there's maybe not most people, but there'll be a lot of people who, if they committed a crime, they don't necessarily want to admit to it, Maybe they're embarrassed, or maybe they're just none of other people's business. They don't want to report it. So it could be. So here's where the authors talk about the role of a broken home. So the broken home meaning that the child, the young adult, comes from a home where the family is not intact. So home with a biological mother and father was associated with better outcomes. So they are talking about here 32% of young men from intact families compared to 46% for all others. And this is in regards to if the young man was ever stopped by the police. So 32% of those who came from intact families were stopped by the police. So broken homes, 46%. So how about for those booked for an offense? You have 15% from the intact families versus 29% from the broken families. And then convicted, 11% versus 21%. So it's almost like double. It's almost double. But the authors state here, although family setting had an impact on crime, it did not explain away the predictive power IQ. For example, a young man from a broken family and an average IQ had a socioeconomic background, had a 4% chance of being interviewed in jail. Switch his IQ to the second centile, and the odds rise to 22%. Switch his socioeconomic background to the second centile instead, and the odds rise only from 4 to 5%. Same conclusions apply to measures of self-reported crime. So, yes, it makes a difference, but it doesn't explain away how big IQ is in this picture. Then they talk about the role of education and saying that there's kind of weak data in regards to this. Although there's this gentleman, Harwin Voss, in 1974, had stated, so until Delbert Elliott and Harvin Voss published a study in 1974 that concluded the opposite. Crime diminished after school dropout. And they were saying they tried to see this from the NLSY. It makes little sense to examine the continuing role of IQ in our usual educational samples when the action is so conspicuously concentrated among those who fall neither in the high school nor college graduate samples. And they talk about restriction of range here. Not much can be concluded from the fact that the ones at the very bottom of the cognitive ability distribution were less likely to report high levels of criminal activity. For these school dropouts, the likelihood of having been interviewed in jail rose as IQ fell, but the relationship was weaker for the unrestricted sample of white males. So it's kind of hard to say how education fits in this, because look at that from 1974, crime diminished after school dropout. Kind of interesting. To conclude, I mean, that's kind of where we will leave off there. I'm trying to think if there was anything else here in this final paragraph. Yeah, that's really going to be it, guys. What do you guys think? Does lower IQ mean you are more susceptible to crime, or are there other things that you can potentially think of here that are going to have an effect on crime? Because from the authors are saying here, yeah, maybe socioeconomic status. Yeah, I mean, maybe a broken home, but it doesn't explain away this IQ problem. I don't know if the data was quite as clear on this chapter. I mean, it definitely seems like it made a difference, but not as staggering, I think, as I would have thought it would have. But let me know what you guys think. Leave a comment down below in the video. If you want to start a conversation, if you have a different point of view, let me know. If you've made it this far in the video, thank you so much for listening. We will be back next week with Chapter 12. Stay tuned for that. I still got to get out another book. I might be starting another book soon. I still got to think about that. And thank you very much for listening, guys. My name is Chris. This has been Chee-Tash. Take care.